So, imagine you are a detective working a cold case.
Okay.
But not just any cold case. We're talking, like, the coldest case imaginable. You don't have DNA evidence. There's
Yeah.
no CCTV footage you can pull. You don't even have a body to autopsy.
Right.
Because the incident you were investigating happened 2,000 years ago.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare assignment.
Right. The witnesses have been dead for millennia. The physical evidence is basically turned to dust. And yet your boss is telling you to write a definitive report on what actually happened.
It's the ultimate historical puzzle. I mean, usually when we look that far back, historians are popping champagne if they can just confirm a name on a broken piece of pottery or get a date right within a decade.
Exactly. But today, the stakes for you, our listener, are a little higher than pottery shards. We are investigating what is perhaps the most controversial event in human history.
The resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah. And before anyone tunes out thinking, this is going to be some Sunday sermon, it's not.
No, definitely not. We aren't looking at this devotionally today. We're looking at it strictly forensically.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We're stripping away all the theology, the stained glass, the emotional baggage. We want to know how historians, whether they are religious, atheist, agnostic, whatever, find common ground on a miracle claim.
Yeah, the question is it even possible to establish a bedrock of truth when everyone involved has a completely different agenda?
Exactly.
And it actually is possible. That's what makes the source material we're looking at today so incredibly compelling. It argues that the historical consensus is much, much broader than most people realize.
That's just wild to think about.
It is. When you look at the actual data, the gap between the skeptical historian and the believing historian isn't some massive canyon. It's actually quite narrow.
That sounds really optimistic because, in my experience, you can't even get 5 people to agree on a pizza topping, let alone the origins of Christianity.
Fair point.
So let's start with the rules of engagement. We are looking at a method from our sources called the minimal facts framework. What exactly is this? Because it sounds like, I don't know, is this just a fancy way for apologists to say, here's why I'm right?
No, and that's a crucial distinction. The minimal facts approach was largely systematized by a historian named Gary Habermas. And his rule for this is incredibly strict.
Okay.
He argues that if you want to be totally objective about the resurrection or the origins of Christianity, you have to start by throwing out the Bible as a quote-unquote holy book.
Wait, throw it out. That seems really counterintuitive if you're literally investigating Jesus.
Well, you throw out the assumption that it's inspired or inerrant. For the sake of the investigation, you just treat the New Testament documents merely as ancient texts.
Oh, I see.
Right. They get subjected to the exact same brutal scrutiny as Caesar's Gallic Wars or, the writings of Tacitus. And here is the kicker. You can only build your case using data points that meet 2 very specific criteria.
All right, lay them on me. What are the rules?
Criterion 1 is that the data must be strongly evidenced by normal historical methods.
Meaning what, exactly?
We're talking multiple independent sources, early dating, enemy attestation, just standard historical tools of the trade.
Got it.
And criterion 2, and this is the really hard one, the data point must be granted by virtually all scholars who study the subject, regardless of their worldview.
Virtually all. That is a bold claim. Are we talking about just Christian scholars, or does this include the skeptics too?
That's the minimal part of the minimal facts. We are talking about the entire spectrum. Atheist historians, agnostic textual critics, Jewish theologians, liberal scholars who deny the miraculous entirely.
Wow.
Yeah. The framework asserts that there are certain events in the timeline of Jesus where even the harshest critics look at it and say, okay, historically speaking, the evidence is so strong that we have to admit this specific thing happened.
So it's basically like a Venn diagram. You have what the fundamentalists believe on one side, what the atheists believe on the other. And this framework only lives in that tiny overlapping sliver in the middle.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. It creates an objective common ground. The whole argument is, let's just see where the facts that everyone agrees on lead us. If you build an argument solely on the things the skeptics admit are true, then the skeptics have to engage with your conclusion.
I really like that. It's almost like historical judo. You're using the skeptic's own admissions to build the case.
Right.
So, looking at our source text, it outlines 5 specific facts that survive this brutal vetting process. Let's walk through the timeline. Where does this consensus actually start?
It starts at the end, essentially. Fact number 1 is the death of Jesus by Roman crucifixion.
Okay, this feels pretty basic, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. Do we actually know he died?
Yes.
Because I've heard theories, I think it's called the swoon theory, that suggests he just passed out on the cross from the pain, appeared dead, and then woke up later in the cool air of the tomb. Does the academic community take that seriously at all?
Practically 0%.
Really?
The source is very clear on this. The crucifixion of Jesus is considered one of the most certain facts of the ancient world. We aren't just relying on the Gospels here either.
Because that would meet the criteria.
Exactly. We have the Roman historian Tacitus, who casually refers to the execution in his annals. We have the Jewish historian Josephus. We have the Syrian satirist Lucian.
So you have openly hostile witnesses confirming the death.
Precisely. And from just a pure medical and historical perspective, the Romans were professional killers. That was literally their job.
They didn't mess around.
They didn't do halfway. If you were nailed to a cross, you didn't survive. One scholar in our notes, Gerd Ludman, who is a staunch atheist, by the way, he writes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is indisputable.
Okay, so the swoon theory is totally dead on arrival. Fact one is solid. He's executed. The timeline is anchored. Now we move to the immediate aftermath. Fact number two, according to our source, is the empty tomb.
Right. Now, we do need to be a little nuanced here. Habermas sometimes lists this one as a second-tier fact because the consensus isn't quite 100%. It's more like 75% of scholars.
Okay, so a strong majority, but not virtually all.
Exactly. But our source includes it as a primary pillar because the historical case for it is just incredibly difficult to get around.
Why is it even debated by that 25%? Is it just because an empty tomb implies a miracle happened?
Partly, yes. It naturally makes skeptics uncomfortable, but historically, the argument for the empty tomb relies heavily on something called the Jerusalem factor.
The Jerusalem factor, what's that?
Think about the geography. Christianity launched in Jerusalem. That is the very city where Jesus was publicly executed and buried. If the disciples started preaching, hey, he is risen in Rome or Athens, people might buy it because they couldn't just walk down the street and check. But they were preaching it in Jerusalem literally weeks after the event.
Oh, I see. So if the tomb wasn't actually empty, the religious authorities who, let's remember, desperately wanted this new movement crushed, they could have just gone to the tomb, rolled away the stone, and pointed at the body.
Exactly. They could have just said, here is the corpse, show is over, everyone go home.
But they didn't.
They didn't. The historical record shows that the early enemies of Christianity did not deny the tomb was empty. Instead, their counter-argument was that the disciples stole the body.
Which is a massive tacit admission that the body was actually gone. I mean,
Right.
you don't invent a complex grave-robbing story if the body is still just sitting right there.
Correct. But there's another layer to this that I think is even more compelling for historians. It's called the criterion of embarrassment.
I've actually heard of this. This is the idea that people don't typically invent details that make themselves look bad or incompetent.
Right. You nailed it. If you're writing a piece of propaganda or a fiction, you make your heroes look heroic. You make your movement look strong and reliable. But in the gospel accounts, who are the very first witnesses to the empty tomb?
There's a group of women, Mary Magdalene and a few others.
Right. And in first century Jewish society, unfortunately, a woman's testimony was considered virtually worthless in a court of law. It held almost no legal weight.
Oh, well.
So if you are a first century fiction writer and you're inventing a story from scratch to convince a patriarchal society that the Messiah is back from the dead, you would never, ever have women discover the empty tomb. You'd have Peter find it. Or John.
Because that would instantly give it credibility with the audience you're trying to reach.
Exactly. The fact that all four Gospels independently say it was women is highly significant to historians. It strongly suggests the writers recorded it that way simply because that is what actually happened, even though it was deeply culturally embarrassing for their movement at the time.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we have a definitive death and we have a missing body. But honestly, a missing body is just a mystery. It's not a resurrection. Grave robbery was a real thing. People go missing. That brings us to fact number 3, which our source identifies as the real catalyst for the whole movement, the disciples' transformation.
Yes. This is really the psychological core of the entire framework. You have to look closely at the state of these men immediately after the crucifixion.
They were a complete mess, right?
Mess is putting it lightly. Their leader was dead, utterly crushed by the Roman Empire. All their messianic hopes were totally shattered. In their cultural context, a crucified Messiah wasn't a tragedy. It was a contradiction in terms.
It meant he failed.
Worse than that, it meant he was cursed by God. They were in hiding, terrified that the Romans were coming to put them on crosses next.
And then, practically overnight, they completely flip.
They go from cowering behind locked doors to standing in the streets of Jerusalem, shouting to the authorities that Jesus is alive. And the source really emphasizes that this wasn't just some vague spiritual feeling of, oh, his spirit lives on in our hearts.
Right, it was physical.
They claim specific interactive encounters. They claim they saw him, they touched him, they ate meals with him.
But people claim to see things all the time. I mean, people see Elvis in the grocery store, people see Bigfoot in the woods. Why do historians give this specific claim so much academic weight?
It entirely comes down to what they're willing to pay for that claim. The source focuses heavily on their willingness to suffer. We have very good historical evidence that these men were routinely beaten, imprisoned, and many were brutally executed specifically for this testimony.
But hold on a second. People die for false beliefs all the time. You have kamikaze pilots, suicide bombers, cult members. Does their willingness to die really prove the resurrection is true? Doesn't it just prove that they sincerely believe it was true?
That is the crucial distinction. You just hit the nail on the head. People will absolutely die for a lie that they mistakenly believe is the truth.
Right.
A suicide bomber believes he's going to be rewarded in the afterlife. He's wrong, but he believes it. But nobody willingly dies for a lie that they personally know is a lie.
Explain how that applies here.
Well, if the resurrection was a deliberate hoax, that means the disciples themselves were the ones who faked it. They were the ones who snuck past the guards and stole the body.
Okay.
If they stole the body, they knew for a fact Jesus was dead. So you have to ask yourself as a historian, would these men willingly endure years of torture, poverty, and eventually violent death for something they personally orchestrated and knew was a total scam?
Liars make poor martyrs.
Exactly. Human nature just doesn't work that way. People lie to get out of trouble, to get money, to get power. They don't lie to get crucified upside down or beheaded. The minimal facts framework argues that their sincere conviction that they had literally seen the risen Jesus is a historical bedrock fact that demands an explanation. You can't just write it off as them making up a con.
Okay, I grant you that the inner circle genuinely believed it.
Mhm.
But they were his closest friends. They were heavily grieving. I could just hear the skeptics shouting, hallucination! Or groupthink. They wanted him to be back so badly that their brains just projected it.
That is definitely the standard counter-argument, grief hallucinations. And honestly, if the only witnesses were the fan club, that theory might actually hold some water.
But they weren't the only ones.
Right. This is where the cage really shuts tight on those alternative theories. The next two facts deal with people who were definitively not in the fan club.
Let's talk about those hostile witnesses. Fact number 4, Paul.
Paul, or Saul of Tarsus as he was known, is a massive problem for the hallucination theory because he wasn't grieving Jesus at all. He actively hated the movement.
He's the guy literally hunting them down, wasn't he?
He's a Pharisee of Pharisees. He viewed early Christianity as a dangerous, blasphemous heresy that needed to be cut out like a cancer. He had prestige, he had power, and he had the law entirely on his side. He had zero motive to convert.
It would have ruined his life.
Converting meant absolute social suicide. He went from the hunter to the hunted.
And yet we have his own writings. Historically undisputed letters where he flat out says, I saw him.
He attributes his complete 180-degree turn in life to a direct post-execution encounter with the risen Jesus. You do not hallucinate your sworn enemy coming back to life and glory to validate the exact movement you are dedicating your life to destroying. It fundamentally violates every psychological profile of a hallucination.
Wow. And he's not even the only skeptic who flipped. That brings us to fact number 5, which is James. And this one always strikes me as the most personal because this is Jesus' own brother.
It is deeply personal. And the Gospels are remarkably honest about this dynamic. During Jesus' actual life, his brothers didn't believe him. In the Gospel of Mark chapter 3, they actually go out to physically seize Jesus and drag him home because they think he has completely lost his mind.
Which, to be fair, is a totally reasonable reaction. If my brother suddenly started walking around claiming to be the prophesied Messiah, I would tell him to sit down and drink a glass of water. I would be the absolute last person on earth to buy it.
That is a very human, very accurate way to look at it. And historically, that seems to be exactly what happened. James was a known skeptic. He wasn't following Jesus around. He wasn't a disciple.
Right.
But then you fast forward just a few years, and James is suddenly the primary leader of the Christian church in Jerusalem. And the historian Josephus records that James was eventually stoned to death for his unwavering faith in his brother.
What could possibly change a sibling's mind like that?
The source points to an ancient creed found in 1 Corinthians 15. This creed actually predates the letter itself by decades, going right back to the beginning. And it specifically lists an individual appearance to James. The most logical historical explanation for why a deeply skeptical brother would willingly die worshiping his sibling as God is that he saw something undeniable that completely shattered his skepticism.
So let's step back and look at the whole stack of evidence. We have the execution, that's fact 1, the empty tomb, fact 2, the radical transformation of the disciples, fact 3, the sudden conversion of the enemy, Paul, fact 4, and the conversion of the skeptic, James, fact 5.
Those are the 5 pillars. And remember, the real challenge of this framework is that any alternative theory you come up with has to successfully explain all 5 of these facts simultaneously.
Right. You don't get to just pick and choose the easy ones. So let's actually test the hypotheses. We already shot down the swoon theory earlier. He definitely didn't survive the cross. And we touched on the conspiracy theory, the idea that they stole the body.
Which totally fails because of the disciples' sincere willingness to suffer and die. You just don't die for a prank. And it completely fails to explain Paul or James. Why on earth would Paul join a conspiracy run by people he passionately hated? Why would James join a dangerous scam run by his dead brother's crazy friends? It makes no sense.
Okay, so what about the big one? The hallucination theory. Because this is really what most modern skeptics lean on today. They say, look, people see things under extreme stress. Maybe Peter hallucinated, and then the others just got caught up in the emotional fervor.
It is definitely the most popular naturalistic theory, but it hits a massive brick wall with the minimal facts. First of all, group hallucinations are not a recognized psychological or medical phenomenon. Hallucinations are internal and individual, just like dreams. You can't share a hallucination with a room full of people any more than you can share a dream with someone sleeping next to you.
But even if you grant that, let's say, they miraculously all had a simultaneous identical mental break, it still doesn't explain the empty tomb.
Bingo. If Peter is hallucinating in the upper room that Jesus is walking around alive, the physical body is still rotting in the grave. All the Roman or Jewish authorities have to do is march down to the tomb and point at the corpse. The hallucination theory attempts to explain the experiences, albeit poorly, but it does absolutely nothing to explain the physical vacancy of the tomb.
And as we just discussed, it completely fails on Paul.
Right. Paul wasn't in the inner circle to experience the groupthink. He wasn't grieving, so he wasn't in the right headspace for a grief hallucination. So if you rely on the hallucination theory, you are left with a hypothesis that requires a multifaceted, totally unprecedented miracle of mental illness.
A miracle of mental illness.
Yes, simultaneous, identical hallucinations affecting friends, enemies, and skeptics at different times and places, combined with a perfectly timed grave robbery that no one can account for.
It really starts to feel like the naturalistic explanations require way more blind faith than the miracle itself.
That is exactly the argument the source makes. When you rigorously apply the actual historical data, the alternative theories tend to become incredibly ad hoc. You have to awkwardly combine them.
Like Frankenstein theories.
Yes, you have to say, okay, well, maybe the disciples hallucinated, and at the exact same time, someone else completely unrelated stole the body, and later Paul just had a severe sunstroke on the road to Damascus, and the Romans just miraculously forgot to check the tomb to shut it all down. It just gets so incredibly messy and improbable.
Whereas the resurrection hypothesis.
It offers what historians refer to as explanatory scope. It easily and naturally explains the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the dramatic conversions, and the sudden origin of the Christian faith, all in one cohesive stroke. It is the only single key that perfectly fits every single lock.
But here is the elephant in the room. Historians, by their very academic definition, don't do miracles.
Right.
History is strictly about natural cause and effect.
Yeah.
Can a historian, wearing their official academic hat, actually conclude that God raised a man from the dead?
That is definitely the friction point in the academy. Many secular historians will look at this and say, as a historian, I can only report what people in the past claimed happened. I cannot medically confirm a miracle because miracles operate completely outside the observable laws of nature.
Which sounds like a bit of a cop-out.
Well, the minimal facts framework pushes back on that exact limitation. It basically says, okay, sure, maintain your methodological naturalism if you absolutely have to, but you still have to explain the data.
It backs you right into a corner.
It really does. It forces the skeptic to say something profound happened, something entirely inexplicable happened in history that launched the largest, most enduring movement the world has ever seen. And the people who were actually there, who saw it with their own eyes, who bled and died for it, universally claimed it was a physical resurrection.
It's a really fascinating inversion of how we usually think about this stuff. We usually think having faith means closing your eyes to the hard facts and just hoping. But this entire framework suggests that if you open your eyes wide, even just to the minimal, bare-bones facts accepted by the harshest skeptics, you might find yourself staring directly at a very uncomfortable conclusion.
It completely challenges the modern cultural assumption that science and history have somehow disproven these ancient events. The historical data is actually much, much more stubborn than we give it credit for. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, well, you know the quote.
Sherlock Holmes. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But in this specific historical case, the improbable remaining fact is a literal resurrection. So I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on today. If these 5 facts are so incredibly well established in the academic world, if 90 to 95% of scholars across the entire ideological spectrum accept the death, the disciples' experiences, the sudden conversions of Paul and James, why is the popular mainstream perception so completely different? Why do we usually just hear that this is all just myth and ancient legend?
Because we rarely check the footnotes for ourselves. We just casually assume the Bible is a book of fairy tales with no actual historical footing. But when you treat it as raw historical data, the entire picture changes. It really challenges the listener to consider how these bedrock facts should influence their own personal understanding of history and reality.
Maybe it's time to reopen the cold case file for yourself. We've laid out the forensic evidence for you. Now you have to write the final report.
Happy hunting.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into history's biggest mystery. Stay curious, question the narrative, and we will see you next time.